In drawing architecture, I think of three elements. I think of proportion, I think of angles, and I think of alignment. So, angles, particularly the perspective angles, the way horizontal lines slope downwards in one direction or another. And as they slope, they form a pattern. As they move above the level of the viewing or of the camera, they increase in angle, and so they end up creating a fan shape. I think of proportion. So for instance, when we look at this tower on the left-hand side, if we look carefully, we can see that the top third section is actually slightly thinner and taller than the center section. The proportion is different. It's thinner and taller in proportion than the center one. So when we draw, we want to try and capture the difference of proportion of different shapes. And the third element I concentrate on is alignment. What things line up with each other, particularly on the vertical, but also on the horizontal. And so we see these windows on the round towers line up with each other. They align with each other. But we can use alignment not just for elements that are the same, that are in a straight line. But for instance, if I look at this gable that I'm drawing now, where does that line come down to, where my pen just was? Well, I align that with what's happening on the tower that I've already drawn. And I can see that that points about halfway, maybe slightly less than halfway, between the top of the tower and the top of the window that's there. And so I align with what I've already drawn. And if I work hard to keep all of these things tightly accurate, if I look at the proportions of a shape before I try and draw it and get a sense of what's the relationship of the height to the breadth and what angles are involved and what sort of line do I have to draw to capture that angle and how a thing align, and then how are things aligned with each other, then I have a reasonable chance of starting to represent what I'm looking at in terms of architecture fairly accurately. And so I concentrate on these two towers first because, as far as I can see, they're going to be the easiest elements to draw and also the easiest elements to get the proportions correct in a fairly straightforward way. And once I've done that, I can use those lines and that line work to align the building as it moves off to the left and as it moves off to the right. It will help me get the angles, it will help me get the alignment and the proportions correct, because they then will depend on what I've already drawn, which will also make it faster to draw. So I find in drawing architecture, it's a lot faster the second half of the drawing. So we shouldn't be afraid if it's a little bit slow and steady at the start, because we're establishing our reference points and we want them to be accurate. There's no point using a ruler if all the divisions marked on it are different widths. So we want to keep our angles correct. We want to keep our proportions of the various shapes that we draw correct. And we want to keep our alignment correct. Things that line up above and below or to each side of each other, we want to align them in that way. But we can also use alignment for different shapes in different parts of the structure that just happen by coincidence to visually line up in our reference. We can line them up on our drawing once we've drawn the original reference points. So now I'm doing this railing. I'm using a 0.1 millimeter pen, a fairly fine pen for me. And as we get towards the as we get towards the right-hand side of the railing, it's almost becoming just a pale grey tone value. And so now I can align these windows with the ones below. Now, we're not looking straight on at this structure, so we do get a depth line on one direction. On this side, on the right-hand side of things, on the right-hand side of the windows. But then we get the depth line on the left-hand side of the pilasters. So it's important, at least on some of the windows, the more significant ones, the larger ones, the closer ones, it's important to be able to get that depth line in to suggest the three-dimensionality, or not to suggest it, but to try and capture it. If there are further parts of our scene where there just isn't room to put an extra line, that's okay, because at that point, our brain will just presume that what it saw more easily, more closely, applies there as well. So, having worked this much out, I'm now just finishing the elements of the roof before I push on now to this part. And so you can see I align that line with the window on the right-hand side of the tower. I've got my angles already worked out from what I've drawn already, but of course I still always check the reference as well as checking my drawing. And I align where these windows line up on this straight wall alongside the river with the details that I've drawn on that right-hand tower. And these are going to be fairly gestural because they're further away. You're watching me draw this at 2.5 times speed. So this took me almost 30 minutes to draw in real time. In some ways, the architecture wasn't so much the time-consuming part as things such as the rail and the waterfront. So this is the River Seine in Paris, and this building is the Concierge, where Louis XVI and Maria Antoinette spent their final days. So it's a very old building indeed. And you'll see that I'm using a row of dotted lines just to give me the angle for the tops of those gables, because they line up on the horizontal and therefore they have to line up on whatever perspective angle we have working there. And the dotted line, I find, the dots that don't coincide with the gables really aren't noticeable afterwards, particularly because there is a roof there. And you'll notice with that decorative element on the very top of the roof line, I'm just trying to capture the effect of the iron lacework there. I'm not trying to draw the detail of it in any way. Now, I strengthen the lines towards the bottom of the two towers there, of the conical roofs on the towers. But after I stop the camera, I actually strengthen the line all the way to the top because it photographed very distinctly. The darker lines appeared darker and the lighter parts almost disappeared. So it looked as if I hadn't drawn the tops of the towers, so I changed that. But as you can see now, again, I'm trying to just very quickly suggest the detail that we see where the riverbank wall has been stained by the rise and fall of the river and the growth of various marine bits and pieces. So again, I'm trying to capture the effect. I don't want to get bogged down because I don't want too much line work there, because if there's too much line work down the bottom, it will start to draw the eye too much from our main subject, and we want to keep the main thing, visually, the main thing. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, what do you think of this fairly brisk sketch of the concierge in Paris. It's a very distinctive building, very prominent in the centre of the city. And if you want to have a go drawing it yourself, of course, you'll find the reference photo on my channel community page. So you can go there and take a screenshot and have a go yourself. But whatever you decide to draw and however you draw it, whether it's architecture or not, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.